The land stretched wide and untamed, a sweep of rolling plains broken by jagged cliffs and distant blue ridges that rose like silent sentinels on the horizon. It was a land both beautiful and cruel, where the winds carried the scent of dry sage and dust, and where every sunset burned like a fire across the sky. In this unforgiving wilderness lay a small frontier settlement, little more than a scattering of cabins and a trading post perched precariously on the edge of Apache territory. The settlement was new, scarcely 3 years old, and its people lived in a constant tension between hope and fear. They had come chasing promises, fertile land, fresh starts, and the stubborn belief that they could carve a home out of a place that resisted taming. By day, men swung axes to split logs for fences, and women hauled buckets from the shallow creek to water hard-won gardens. At night, though, when the howls of coyotes echoed across the prairie, many whispered of raiding parties, of shadows that moved swift and silent across the land. Every creak of the wind against the cabin walls was enough to keep them awake. Among these settlers was a young woman named Clara. Barely 17, she had grown up sheltered, her life marked more by stories than by experience. Her father, a blacksmith, had brought her west after her mother died in a fever, hoping the distance from grief might offer them both a chance to begin anew. Clara, however, found the frontier a lonely place. The other women were older, hardened by childbearing and endless work, while the young men were rough, their eyes already dulled by liquor and dust. Clara's days were filled with chores, mending torn garments, grinding corn, sweeping the dirt floor of their cabin, but her mind wandered often to the books she had carried from the East. Tattered romances and tales of faraway kingdoms dotted it. Was in these stories that Clara first learned to imagine the world beyond her walls. Yet, in truth, the real frontier was nothing like the novels she clung to. The wild did not care for innocence or ideals of noble knights. It was a place where survival hinged on the strength of one's arm, the steadiness of one's aim, and the ability to make peace with fear. Clara sensed this, though she had never experienced it directly. The Apache were often spoken of in the settlement, though rarely with nuance or truth. To the settlers, they were both a looming threat and an unknowable mystery. Tales of ambushes, circulated after church on Sundays, passed from lip to lip until they became half myth. The men spoke of warriors fierce and proud, painted for war and riding like spirits across the plains. The women, whispering while kneading bread or hanging laundry, painted darker images. Stolen daughters, burned homesteads, unspeakable acts. These stories seeped into Clara's imagination until they blended with her own fancies. She feared them, yes, but she was also fascinated. The Apache were the embodiment of everything the frontier promised: danger, freedom, and the uncharted. Unknown, Clara's life was marked by stillness. Days passed in a rhythm so steady it lulled her into thinking nothing would ever truly change. Yet just beneath that stillness pulsed the tension of the land itself, a silent reminder that safety here was only ever borrowed, never owned. Every fence post her father hammered into the soil felt like a challenge to the wilderness. Every cabin door bolted at night was a fragile defense against forces too vast to measure. Clara lived within this paradox, the security of her small home and the vast uncertainty just beyond it. She often found herself drawn outside at twilight, when the sun sank low and the world seemed caught between light and shadow. She would stand by the edge of the cornfield, skirts brushing against the brittle stalks, and gaze out at the endless horizon. Sometimes, if the wind shifted, she imagined she could see riders in the distance, their silhouettes flickering like ghosts against the dying light. It was only her imagination, she told herself, but her heart would race all the same. That unease grew stronger as autumn deepened. Signs of approaching change lingered in the air: the migration of geese overhead, the bite of frost at dawn, the sense of something unseen drawing closer. The settlement's men grew restless, cleaning their rifles more often, speaking in hushed voices at the trading post. Clara noticed the way her father's jaw tightened each evening as he glanced at the horizon before bolting the cabin door. It was in this climate of quiet, dread, and unspoken anticipation that fate moved silently toward Clara. She did not yet know how swiftly her world would shift, how one moment could break the illusion of safety she had clung to. For now, she remained the sheltered virgin on the edge of two worlds, one of fragile civilization and another of untamed wilderness. And though she did not yet realize it, the thin boundary between those worlds was about to dissolve through an encounter that would begin not with violence, but with a whisper, "Be gentle, please." The day began like any other. The sun rose pale and gold over the horizon, spreading its light across the settlement and turning the cabins into glowing silhouettes. Clara had been sent by her father to fetch water from the creek that cut a narrow line through the grasslands. It was a task she had done many times before, though he usually went himself. That morning, however, he was repairing the roof, and Clara, eager to escape the cabin's confinement, agreed to go in his place. She wrapped a shawl around her shoulders, took the wooden bucket, and walked the half-mile down the narrow path to the water. The world was unusually quiet. No birds called from the brush, no breeze rustled the tall grass. Even the creek seemed subdued, its usual chatter softened as though the land itself were holding its breath. Clara noticed, but only faintly, her thoughts more concerned with the way her boots kicked up dust and how the morning air smelled faintly of wood smoke from the cabins. She knelt by the creek, dipping her bucket into the cool stream. The water rippled and splashed, glinting like shards of glass in the light. She was so focused on steadying the bucket that she did not see the shadow moving silently behind her. Not until she straightened and turned, droplets still clinging to her hands, did she realize she was no longer alone. An Apache warrior stood just a few paces away. Clara froze. Her heart leapt to her throat, and the bucket nearly slipped from her hands. He was tall, his skin bronze in the sunlight, his dark hair bound back with leather. He wore no heavy coat or boots like the settlers, only leggings and moccasins, a band of beads and feathers marking him as something both alien and commanding. His eyes fixed on her with an intensity that rooted her to the spot. For a long moment, neither moved. The silence between them was thick, broken only by the trickle of the creek. Clara's breath came shallow and fast. Every warning story she had ever heard echoed in her mind. They strike without mercy. They steal. They destroy. Run if you can. Yet her body would not obey. Her feet felt carved from stone. The Apache did not raise a weapon. Instead, he stepped closer, slow and deliberate, as though studying her. Clara instinctively took a step back, her heel slipping against the wet bank. The bucket toppled, spilling water across the dirt, but she did not notice. Her gaze was locked on him, on the unreadable calm in his face. When he finally spoke, his voice was low, steady, and carried the weight of command. She could not understand the words, but she did not need to. The meaning was clear enough. She was not to move, not to scream, not to resist. His hand rested lightly on the knife at his side, not in threat, but as a reminder of power. Clara's body trembled. She thought of her father back at the cabin, of the settlement beyond the rise, so close and yet impossibly far. If she screamed, would anyone hear? And if they did, would they arrive in time? She swallowed hard, her lips parting as though to call for help, but the sound died in her throat. The Apache stepped closer still, closing the space between them. His presence was overwhelming, silent, assured, utterly in control. Clara's eyes darted to the trees, the open field, the creek. There was nowhere to run. She felt her knees weaken, her breath shallow and desperate. In that moment, she did the only thing her frightened, innocent heart could think to do. She whispered, her voice trembling like a leaf in the wind, "Be gentle, please. Will it hurt?" Her words were barely audible, but the warrior's gaze sharpened. He tilted his head slightly, as though weighing their meaning. Clara clutched the edge of her shawl, waiting for whatever would come. She expected violence, or at the very least roughness, the fulfillment of every whispered warning that had haunted her nights. Instead, what followed was something entirely different. The warrior's hand left the knife. His expression shifted, softened by something she could not name. Slowly he reached forward, not to strike, but to grasp the fallen bucket, lifting it from the dirt. He dipped it into the creek and filled it again, water sloshing over the rim. Then, without a word, he placed it at her feet. Clara's breath caught. She looked down at the bucket, then back up at him, her fear mixing with bewilderment. He met her gaze for a heartbeat longer, his dark eyes unreadable, before stepping back. His movements were precise, measured, as though he wanted her to see that no harm was meant. Yet in that silence, in the sheer closeness of him, Clara felt the world tilt. This was not the monster her people had painted in their stories. This was a man, alive and real, whose choices held her fate. And though her heart still thundered with fear, another feeling stirred faintly beneath it, something she could not yet name. The capture had begun, but not in the way anyone, least of all Clara, had imagined. Clara's knees nearly gave way beneath her as she stood before the Apache warrior. The weight of his presence pressed down on her like a storm-heavy sky. He had returned her bucket of water, an act of surprising gentleness, but his nearness, his unreadable eyes, kept her heart pounding so furiously she feared he might hear it. She could not run. Even if she had tried, her legs would have betrayed her. The creek was shallow, the banks muddy. She would fall before she could make it 3 steps. And beyond that, the thought chilled her, what if more of his people were hidden in the trees? Watching? Clara's world had collapsed into this moment, into the silent figure standing before her, and she felt the thin line between her survival and her destruction balanced in his hands. Her lips parted once, twice, but no sound came. She wanted to ask him what he wanted, why he was here, if he meant to take her away from everything she had ever known. The words tangled in her throat, strangled by fear. Her father's warnings echoed through her mind, woven with the stories of other women who had disappeared into the wilderness, their fates whispered about but never truly known. Clara's imagination filled the silence with terrible images, each one sharper than the last, and yet she remembered the way he had picked up her bucket, how careful his movements had been, how deliberate. Not hurried, not harsh, not cruel. She felt the contradiction twist within her. This man was both her greatest fear and, somehow, her only protector in that moment. The weight of that realization broke something open inside her. Fear no longer allowed silence. She lowered her eyes, her voice trembling like a bird's wing caught in the wind, and whispered, "Be gentle, please. Will it hurt?" The words left her mouth before she could fully think them through. They were raw, instinctive, the only plea she could form when faced with what she believed was inevitable. Her question carried many meanings, but to her it was simple. If you must take from me, if you must hurt me, do not be cruel. The air seemed to still. The Apache warrior tilted his head, his sharp gaze softening with curiosity. For the first time, he looked less like a figure of dread and more like a man caught off guard. The corners of his mouth did not move, but something shifted in his eyes, something Clara could not name. He stepped closer, and she flinched. His hand rose, and she braced herself, clutching her shawl to her chest as though it were armor. But instead of grasping her, he reached past her, plucking a strand of grass from where it had tangled in her sleeve. He held it up for a moment, then let it drift away on the breeze. His movements were slow, deliberate, almost ceremonial. Clara stared at him, breathless, stunned by the strangeness of it. Was he mocking her? Was this some gesture she did not understand? The stories her people told had never prepared her for this strange gentleness. This restraint. Her plea hung between them, unanswered, echoing louder in her mind with every heartbeat. She wanted to take the words back, to swallow them. But it was too late. They belonged to the space between them now. She dared to raise her eyes to his again. He studied her with an intensity that made her skin prickle, but there was no cruelty in it. Instead, it was as if he were trying to read her soul, to understand what she had meant by her trembling plea. His silence was both terrifying and strangely merciful. At last, he made a sound, a low hum, deep in his chest, a sound of consideration rather than anger. Then he spoke in his own tongue, the syllables smooth and foreign, carrying a cadence. Like flowing water. Clara could not understand, but she felt, rather than knew, the meaning. No harm will come. Tears welled in her eyes, though she fought them back. Her body still trembled, but not entirely from fear now. Relief mingled with confusion, with a dawning awareness that the world was far more complicated than the black and white stories of her settlement had ever allowed. The warrior turned his head slightly, as though listening to something beyond her, the wind, the land, perhaps unseen companions. Then his gaze returned to her. He motioned for her to pick up the bucket. His gesture was firm, commanding, but not violent. Clara hesitated, her mind reeling. She had asked for gentleness, expecting cruelty. Instead, she had received this, an unexpected mercy. Her innocence, her naivety, had not been shattered as she feared. Instead, it had been met with something that felt almost like protection. Her heart still thundered as she obeyed, lifting the bucket once more. Her fingers were unsteady, water sloshing over the rim, but she held it tight. The Apache did not stop her. He simply stepped back, creating space, though his eyes never left her. Clara realized then that her plea, spoken in desperation, had changed everything. It had revealed her fear, her vulnerability, but it had also opened the door neither of them had expected. She had asked for gentleness, and impossibly, it had been granted. The words still lingered in the air between them, fragile as spider silk. "Be gentle, please. Will it hurt?" Clara's voice had trembled, and though she had spoken in English, her tone pleading, fragile, raw, was universal. The Apache warrior had heard the sound of fear in many voices before, from men, from soldiers, from prisoners. Yet this was different. This was not a cry of defiance. It was not the bluster of men who tried to mask their terror behind anger. This was the soft, bare voice of a girl who had not yet learned the armor of adulthood. And strangely, it unsettled him. He had approached her with purpose. At first, she was nothing more than an opportunity, a settler's daughter, alone and vulnerable, proof of how unguarded the outsiders could be. He could have taken her life with a single motion. He could have carried her away as a warning, a bargaining tool, a mark of Apache dominance. He had expected resistance, screaming, perhaps even an attempt at escape. He had expected the familiar pattern. Instead, she had given him honesty, naked and trembling. A plea, not for her life, but for mercy. And that plea stirred something unexpected. He studied her closely now, his eyes steady and sharp. She stood before him, clutching her shawl tight, her knuckles pale from the strain. Her lips trembled, though she tried to hold them still. She was fragile, yes, but not without courage. He saw it in the way she did not collapse under his gaze, in the way she lifted her chin just enough to meet his eyes despite the terror swimming in them. His hand lingered near his knife, then fell away. There was no need for it. He had power already not in steel, but in the silence, in her fear, in her plea. And in that power he found no satisfaction. Instead, he found curiosity. Why would she ask such a thing? Why this question when others begged for freedom, for their lives, for God to intervene? Her words were not of survival, but of surrender, ansovens. Acceptance that she could not stop what might come, only hope it would not be cruel. He turned the thought over in his mind like a stone in the river, smooth and heavy, shaped by forces beyond its control. For a moment, he saw her not as an enemy's child, but as something else, a reflection of innocence the world had long stripped from him. Once long ago he had known gentleness too. He remembered the sound of his mother's voice when she sang at dusk, the feel of his younger sister's hand clutching his as they walked the ridges. Those things had been taken by war, burned away by soldiers who came with rifles and flags. Since then, he had lived by the rule of the blade, the horse, and the bow. Yet here, standing before him, was someone untouched by that harshness, someone whose voice still carried the soft weight of trust. He tilted his head slightly, studying her with renewed interest. She mistook the gesture as threat and flinched. Drawing her shawl tighter, his gaze softened. He did not reach for her. Instead, he crouched down slowly, deliberately, and drew a shape in the dirt with his finger. A line, then another crossing it, forming a symbol known to his people, meaning peace. Clara stared, uncomprehending at first. Her breath hitched, and she shifted uneasily, unsure of what he meant. But she saw, at least, that his hand was not raised in anger, that his movements were calm, measured, almost careful. When he rose again, he met her eyes, his expression unreadable but no longer hard. He spoke in his language low, even, like the murmur of a stream over stones. She did not know the words, but she felt their weight. Something in his tone told her he was not mocking, not threatening. It was as if he was answering her plea, though in words she could not grasp that her heart still hammered in her chest, but a thread of confusion wove into the fear. She had expected cruelty, but what she saw instead was restraint. He could have harmed her. He had not. He could have mocked her. He had not. Her plea had not been dismissed. It had been acknowledged. The warrior's eyes lingered on her one last time, searching as though trying to understand who she was beneath the fear. Then he stepped back. The motion was subtle, but it carried meaning. He was giving her space. A gesture she had not expected, a gesture that contradicted everything she had been told about his people. Clara's breath came uneven, her body still trembling, but within her chest something shifted. The terrifying shadow of the Apache warrior was no longer just a figure of fear. He was something more complicated, more human. His reaction was not what she or anyone would have imagined. He had heard her plea, and though he said nothing, she could understand he had answered it not with violence, but with gentleness. Clara's words, "Be gentle, please, will it hurt?" still trembled in the air, carrying the weight of her terror. She had spoken them with a single meaning in mind, that if he intended to take her, to strip her of her innocence is all. The whispered warnings had foretold he might at least spare her pain. To her, the words were clear, but the Apache warrior heard them differently in his ears. Softened by memory and loss, her plea was not about the violation she feared, it was about life and death. He thought she meant, "When you kill me, will it hurt? If you must end me, do it gently." It was not an unreasonable assumption. Many captives, cornered and powerless, asked similar questions, but never with such trembling honesty. She had not screamed. She had not begged him to let her go. She had simply asked for kindness in the final act, and that struck him deeply. He looked at her then, truly looked, beyond her pale skin, and frightened. eyes. She was young, unscarred by the brutality that had shaped his world. Her people had brought war and fire into his lands, yet here was one of them, fragile and trembling, asking not for conquest, not for mercy and bargaining, but for gentleness. And in that moment, the world seemed to blur the lines between enemy and human, softening. Clara, unaware of the translation unfolding in his mind, clutched her shawl tighter, her body quivering. She thought her plea had been understood exactly as she meant it, that he was weighing whether to grant her request or ignore it. She dared not meet his eyes for long, fearing that what she might see would confirm her worst imaginings. Instead, she glanced down at the bucket by her feet. The water still shimmered from where he had filled it for her, ripples catching the morning sun. The sight was surreal. He had performed an act of service, something no settler's tale had ever prepared her for. Was this part of the cruelty? She wondered. A game before the storm? Or was it something else? The silence stretched between them. The Apache finally spoke, his voice low, a rumble like distant thunder. The words meant nothing to Clara, syllables flowing in a rhythm unfamiliar to her ears, but his tone was deliberate, calm and almost solemn. He gestured with one hand, pointing not at her but at the horizon, then tapping his chest. She did not understand. Fear and confusion twisted together, and she whispered again, more desperately this time, "Please, be gentle." Her eyes glistened with unshed tears. She thought she was repeating herself, clarifying her fear. But to him, her repetition confirmed his interpretation. She truly believed he meant to kill her. And her request was simple, not to suffer. That realization pierced him like an arrow. He saw then how his presence alone had already wounded her spirit. He had not touched her, yet she believed herself already lost. The settler's stories had painted him as a beast, and her trembling proved how deeply she had absorbed them. For a moment, anger flared in him, anger not at her, but at the endless cycle of fear and lies that kept their peoples apart. Did she not see that mercy was possible? That gentleness could exist even here, on blood-soaked soil? He took a breath, steadying himself. His reaction would define this moment. Slowly, deliberately, he removed the knife from his belt, not to brandish it, but to lay it on the ground between them. The gesture was unmistakable, a stripping away of threat. Clara's eyes widened, her breath catching sharply in her throat. To her, the sight of the blade had first been terror, then confusion. Why would he disarm himself before her? He pointed at the knife, then back at her, shaking his head once. The motion was firm, certain. His meaning was simple. "I will not harm you." Clara's lips parted, but no words came. Relief and disbelief collided inside her, leaving her dizzy. She had expected the knife to define her ending. Instead, it had become the symbol of her reprieve. Her plea had been misunderstood, twisted into a question of life and death. Yet that misunderstanding had saved her. He had answered her, not as a man who sought to dominate, but as one who sought to reassure. The irony was almost too great to grasp. Clara, in her innocence, had thought she was begging him to spare her from a fate of pain and violation. He, in his world-weary experience, had thought she was begging him to spare her from death itself. And in answering that plea, he gave her far more than she had dared to hope for. The twist of meaning hung between them like a fragile thread, binding two people from opposite worlds in a moment of unexpected grace. Neither fully understood the other's words, but both understood the gesture. And for now, that was enough. The knife lay in the dust between them, a glint of steel catching the sun. Clara stared at it as if it were some strange riddle she could not solve. Only moments ago, she had believed that very blade would decide her fate, yet now it rested harmlessly at her feet. Her heart thudded in her chest, each beat loud in the silence. and she dared a glance up at the Apache warrior. He did not move toward the knife. Instead, he stepped back, his dark eyes fixed on her with a steadiness that made her feel both exposed and oddly protected. His hands hung open at his sides, palms visible, as though to prove he held no intent to strike. For the first time since he had appeared, Clara realized he was giving her space, not cornering her, not pressing closer, but deliberately easing the invisible pressure between them. Her body, however, refused to calm. Every muscle still trembled, taut with the memory of fear. She clutched her shawl tighter, her breath unsteady, and whispered again into the silence, "Please, be gentle." The warrior tilted his head, watching her with that unreadable calm. Then, without warning, he moved not toward her, but toward the thicket at the creek's edge where a young willow grew. His steps were sure, silent, his presence commanding even as he turned his back to her. Clara flinched, half expecting others to emerge from the brush, but none came. He bent, snapped off a slender branch, and returned with it in hand. Clara's eyes widened. What was this? A signal? A weapon? She drew back a step, the bucket sloshing water onto her skirts. The warrior stopped before her and crouched low again. With the willow branch, he swept a line across the dirt, then another, forming a crude X over the knife. His gaze lifted to hers, and he shook his head. The message was clear, even if the symbol was strange. The knife had no claim over her. Lips parted, but she could not speak. The tension inside her chest began to loosen, though only slightly, as she watched him. His movements were deliberate, careful, almost ceremonial, as though he knew every gesture mattered. Then, in a slow and unexpected act, he reached to his belt not for another weapon, but for a length of rawhide cord wound there. With a swift motion, he drew his knife, not from threat, but necessity, and sliced the cord into 2 pieces. Clara tensed, certain the moment of mercy had ended, but he ignored her fear. Instead, he extended the cut lengths of leather toward her, placing them gently on the ground at her feet. Confusion welled in her chest. She looked from the strips of leather to his face, searching for meaning. Why offer her bindings? Or were they something else? The Apache pointed at her wrists. His eyes flicked down to where her hands clutched the shawl tightly together. Clara blinked, only then realizing how tightly she had been holding herself, her own fear knotting her body as if bound by invisible cords. Slowly, hesitantly, she lowered the shawl. He shook his head again, then made a cutting motion across his own wrists. The meaning struck her like a bell. He was showing her freedom, not restraint. If she had been tied, he would have cut her loose. The cords at her feet were not for binding, but for breaking. Clara's breath caught. Her knees weakened, and she sank slightly, one hand steadying herself on the bucket. Tears burned at the corners of her eyes, not of terror this time, but of sheer, bewildered relief. She had thought her plea would be ignored, twisted into cruelty. Instead, it had been answered with something she had never imagined. Released at the warrior she had feared as her captor had, in a single act, become her liberator. For a long moment, they remained still, the only sound the gentle ripple of the creek. Clara's tears slipped free, streaking down her cheeks, and she whispered so softly she was unsure if he even heard, "Thank you." The Apache said nothing in return. Words were unnecessary. He simply nodded once, his face composed, and stepped back again. His knife returned to his belt, but only after he wiped the blade clean on the willow branch and cast the twig into the current of the creek, letting it drift away. A ritual of sorts, a dismissal of violence. Clara watched the branch float downstream until it vanished from sight. When she looked back, the warrior was still there, his gaze steady but no longer sharp. She realized with a jolt that she was not his prisoner. She was something else, perhaps a witness, perhaps a reminder. He had chosen not to harm her. He had chosen mercy. Her heart ached with confusion. Why? Why spare her? Why let her go when so many stories said otherwise? She could not know the reasons in his heart, nor the weight of his memories. But she felt the truth of it, undeniable and strange. He had given her freedom where she expected pain. And that unexpected act so simple, so profound, was more disarming than any weapon. Clara stood rooted to the creek bank long after the Apache warrior had stepped back. The water rippled quietly at her feet, the bucket heavy in her trembling hands. For a heartbeat, she believed he might still change his mind, that the mercy he had shown would vanish as suddenly as it appeared. But he remained still, watchful, and though his gaze never softened into a smile, it carried no threat. Then, with the same silence with which he had come, he turned. One step, another. His moccasins pressed soundlessly into the dirt, his frame moving with the ease of someone who belonged wholly to the land. Clara's breath caught as she watched him slip into the tall grass, the willow branches swaying slightly. In his wake. And then he was gone. As though he had never been there at all. The world felt too quiet in his absence. The creek's chatter seemed louder now, the wind through the grass almost startling. Clara's knees weakened, and she sank to the earth, the bucket clattering beside her and spilling water into the dirt. Her shawl slid from her shoulders, and she pressed her trembling hands to her face. Tears came, though she hardly understood them herself. Relief, fear, bewilderment. They tangled together until she could no longer separate one from the other. She had braced herself for violence, for the fulfillment of every dreadful whisper that had haunted the settlement's women. Instead, she had been spared. No more than spared. She had been acknowledged, released, treated with a strange, unexpected gentleness. She thought of her plea, those desperate words she had whispered. Be gentle, please. Will it hurt? The irony of them stung now. She had asked for mercy in violation, yet he had interpreted them as mercy in death. And in granting what he believed she asked for, he had given her more than she ever thought possible, her freedom. Untouched. Clara wiped her tears, though her hand still shook. She forced herself to stand, lifting the bucket once more. The water was half spilled, but she did not refill it. All she wanted now was to return home, to the fragile safety of the cabin walls, though she knew they would no longer feel the same. She gathered her shawl, draped it clumsily around her shoulders, and began the walk back to the settlement. Each step felt heavier than the last. The prairie seemed changed, though she knew it was the same land she had walked that morning. The tall grasses swayed as they always had, and the horizon stretched wide and endless. Yet every shadow seemed deeper, every rustle sharper. Somewhere out there, the warrior moved unseen, perhaps already gone, perhaps watching still. She did not know. When the cabins came into view, Clara's heart raced anew, not with fear of the Apache now, but with fear of what to say. What could she tell her father? What could she tell anyone? That the monster of their stories had spared her? That he had cut her bonds before they were ever tied? That he had looked into her eyes and, instead of cruelty, had shown restraint? They would not believe her. Or worse, they would twist it. They would say she had been lucky, or that she had been foolish to wander so far alone. Some might whisper suspicion, that she had not been spared, but marked, tainted somehow. Clara shuddered at the thought. When she reached the cabin, her father was waiting by the door, hammer still in hand. His brow furrowed when he saw her pale face, the water spilled down her skirt, the trembling in her arms. Clara? He asked sharply. What happened? She opened her mouth. The truth fought at her lips, desperate to be spoken. But the image of the warrior, his calm, his silent mercy, his unexpected act of laying down the knife, rose in her mind. She could not betray it. She could not let the truth be broken into fear-mongering whispers by those who would never understand that, so she shook her head, forcing her voice steady. "I spilled the bucket, that's all." Her father studied her for a long moment, suspicion in his eyes, but he said nothing more. He took the bucket from her hands, set it aside, and returned to his work. Clara slipped inside, her heart still. Hammering, and collapsed onto her bed. In the silence of the cabin, she pressed her hands together as though in prayer. But she did not pray for safety, as she often did. Instead, she prayed she might one day understand what had truly passed between them, because in the aftermath, one thing was certain: the world was no longer as she had been told. Night settled over the settlement with its usual hush. The cabins glowed faintly from their small fires, lanterns flickered in windows, and the air carried the mingled scents of wood smoke and stew. Yet for Clara, the world no longer felt familiar. She sat on the narrow bed in her corner of the cabin, staring at the shadows that danced on the walls. Her father moved about with his usual routines, gruff and steady, but Clara's mind was elsewhere. She could still see the Apache's eyes, dark, steady, unflinching, and the strange gentleness with which he had spared her. That moment at the creek had become imprinted on her soul, as vivid as the book she once devoured, yet infinitely more real. She knew she could never tell the story as it had happened. If she spoke of it, no one would believe her. They would twist it to fit their fears. The savage had toyed with her, they would say. He let her go only to bring greater harm later. And if she tried to defend him, to speak of mercy where they saw only menace, suspicion would turn toward her. A girl on the edge of womanhood could not afford the weight of scandal or doubt. So Clara held the truth within herself. Silent and private, like a fragile flame she dared not expose to the wind. Days passed, and outwardly she resumed her chores. She fetched water, mended clothes, tended the small patch of corn. But inwardly, something had shifted. Where once she had looked at the horizon with dread, imagining shadows of riders and war cries, she now looked with a different ache, one of curiosity, even longing. The wilderness no longer seemed a void filled only with danger. It was also the place where mercy had touched her life. At times she wondered if she had imagined it all. Perhaps the terror had clouded her mind. Perhaps the warrior's actions had meant something entirely different. But each time she remembered the moment he laid the knife on the ground, or the way he had filled her bucket with water, her doubt dissolved. Those were not the acts of cruelty. They were deliberate choices of restraint. Clara began to notice how differently she viewed the world around her. The men in the settlement, with their talk of rifles and raids, seemed harsher now, their bravado hollow compared to the quiet strength she had witnessed. The women, whispering fearful tales as they kneaded bread, no longer filled her with dread, but with sadness. They did not know that the stories were only half-truths, painted in fear and ignorance. She carried her secret like a weight, but also like a gift. It had not been given to anyone else, only to her. And in the solitude of her thoughts, she replayed it again and again, searching for meaning. One evening, weeks later, Clara found herself back at the creek. The settlement had grown quieter with the cold of approaching winter, and she walked alone, shawl drawn tight around her shoulders. She stood by the water's edge, gazing at the place where the willow branch had been snapped, where the knife had once gleamed in the dirt. The world was unchanged. The creek still rippled, the grasses still swayed. Yet for her, everything here bore the weight of memory. She knelt, touched the water, and whispered the words again. "Be gentle, please." This time her voice carried no fear. Instead, it held something softer, hope perhaps, or a wish for the world to be different than the one her people believed it to be. The warrior had answered her, though in a way neither of them fully understood at the time. She had begged him to spare her body from pain, and he had believed she begged him to spare her life. In granting that, he had given her both. And in doing so, he had shown her that gentleness could exist even where she least expected it. Clara
rose, her hands damp, and gazed out at the horizon.
Somewhere beyond, the Apache people lived their lives, hidden from her world but no less real. She would likely never see him again. Their paths had crossed only once, for a fleeting moment. Yet that moment had altered her forever. The irony of it lingered. Her people had built their lives on fear of the Apache, fear of their cruelty, fear of their violence. And yet it was an Apache warrior who had taught her the truth of mercy. Clara carried that truth home with her. She would carry it always. And though she could not speak it aloud, it lived quietly within her, a reminder that even in the harshest wilderness, unexpected gentleness could bloom. And that, more than fear, more than dread, more than any whispered tale, would shape the woman she would one day become.